Hi guys, it is Jackie, co-founder of Plant Chicks, and in light of Black Lives Matter and everything that's transpired over the past week, I wanted to bring my husband Charles on here, and I wanted to open this up. And during the week, I've been doing a lot of soul searching, I've been learning a lot, and I came in and I asked him the other day, I was like, what's your take on all this? So Charles, why don't you share?
Not to sound cynical about any of this. First of all, I'm very happy that Jackie is getting excited about everything that's going on. Not just Jackie, but a lot of my friends who aren't people of color are getting excited, trying to educate themselves, trying to learn what's going on. But for me, as an African American who has lived this experience for 55 years, there's a big part of me that's cynical. Like, okay, why now? Why this person? And maybe it's not even this one person, George Floyd, in his situation. For me, it just felt like it was a combination of sort of getting punched in the face 3 times in a row and finally getting fed up and people getting fed up. And I say 3 times because it all started with the gentleman, Armory, in Georgia, being tracked down and killed by the 2 white men there, followed very soon thereafter by Brianna, the young lady in Louisville, Kentucky, sleep in her bed, and the police storming in with a no-knock warrant. The boyfriend supposedly not knowing who was breaking into the house, firing guns to defend him and his girlfriend, and she being shot 6 or 7 times. And then ultimately the last being the George Floyd incident with a police officer in broad daylight, knowing that he's being filmed, knowing that this man is calling out in pain and in agony, calling to his mom and urinating on himself. And the guy is just standing there or kneeling there with his knee on his neck and throat and killing the man, knowing that he's being filmed, being asked by the other officers, maybe, hey, we should do something else. And he's just looking at the camera and being indifferent. So my point being, all those things back to back to back and other things that have been going on recently was just too much. So that may be it. My concern, however, is that for almost 400 years, African Americans, people of color, have been abused, discriminated against, treated harshly, starting obviously with slavery, working its way through after slavery, mass incarceration of African Americans due to the fact that, okay, we don't have slaves anymore, but that cotton still needs to be picked, that tobacco still needs to be picked. What's the cheapest and easiest way to replace slaves? And it's to charge African Americans for petty and silly crimes and locking them up in prisons. And it's interesting to me, look, this country has always had prisons, but in the Northeast in particular, they were called penitentiaries. And they're called penitentiaries now. But to know the history behind that word and what that means, penitentiaries were places, in particular in the Northeast, where the Quakers, which are an offshoot of Baptists, Protestant Baptists, they ran the penitentiaries. And penitentiaries comes off the root word penitence. So you got in trouble, you got arrested, you went to the penitentiary, where you had a bed and clothing and a Bible, and the expectation was that you would serve penitence so that when you were released, you would not return to prison. You'd learn a trade while in there. Once again, the Bible was taught to you, and the hope was that by being treated with some sense of dignity, that once you left the penitentiary, you wouldn't return. But that's not how it was in the South, and even today. Penitentiaries are prisons, and the sole goal after slavery was to replace the manpower, and that's how they did it. So jaywalking, just stupid little petty crimes, and blacks were arrested. Couple that then with, if you were released, because of the 13th Amendment, you lost all your rights. So you couldn't vote. So now, as an African American, you are now muted with respect to having a voice, being able to speak out, because you were a felon. You had a record. So you couldn't vote. It was difficult, obviously, to get an education. It was difficult to get a house. It was obviously difficult to get a job. So all these things worked against you. And the black family, with respect to most of the men now are in prison, so you don't have a father, you don't have a brother, you don't have an uncle, the strong male role model for the kids, especially the young males in the family. So this cycle would just continue to perpetuate itself. So you go from slavery to mass incarceration to Jim Crow laws in the South, laws that were meant to hold people of color down, to discriminate. So I couldn't drink from the same fountain as a white person. I had to sit in the back of the bus. I had to sit up in the rafters of the movie theater if I wanted to go to see a movie. I couldn't sit at the counters to eat. All these different things that were against African Americans. And there's still places today in the South, in certain places, where we don't serve niggers. Blacks aren't allowed. Restaurants and that kind of thing. And you just sort of know these are the places you're not supposed to go, that you're not allowed. It's a social and cultural thing in those places. Fast forward then through Jim Crow laws and the civil rights movement, but then you're still dealing with discrimination. Discrimination with respect to housing, discrimination with respect to jobs, discrimination with respect to schools. So you have a cluster of white, middle class and wealthy families, and their schools are getting taxes from those neighborhoods, and so then those schools are getting more money, so the education is better. You can pay for better teachers, better resources and stuff. But the black neighborhoods, the tax base is lower because the housing is cheaper and the jobs are less, and so then the schools and the education is not as good as the white neighborhoods. So all these things work against us as black people, as people of color. And I say people of color because it also affects Latino Americans in a major way, and it also affects Native Americans in a huge way. And these same things happen to them. So, so people go, it's funny when you talk to white people, when I hear some of my white friends talk, and they feel like, well, I wasn't a slave owner, you know, my people didn't own slaves. But it's not about that, and it is about that because it started with slavery, but it's tracked through every generation, something that has held people of color back with respect to trying to get ahead. So that's kind of long and drawn out, but a huge part of me just feels like, what's going to change now? What's different? Like I said, I'm very excited. Very happy that people are finally starting to wake up and see these things. It's just sad that it's taken so many lives and so much bloodshed to even get to this point. And exactly what is this point? What has changed other than the marches and the riots and everything? Nothing today has changed. And so, like I said, I'm a little cynical with respect to is it going to change? When is it going to change? What's going to change? The DNA of this country is filled with racism and discrimination and the way we treat poor people and people of need and people of color. And like any virus that's in our system, it's very hard to clear out. And I think this is going to be just as difficult. So,
can you also, thank you for all of that. Can you also share how there's so many levels deep on areas that do need to change, like different government issues, bringing monies into areas. And this country is, and I'm going to give links, like the documentary 13th on Netflix. I watched that. I learned so much. He came in for like 10 minutes of it, and he's like, did he talk about this? And I'm like, yep. He knew everything about the documentary. He hadn't seen it. And I knew pretty much none of it. He recognized people that were in the documentary. I'd never seen most of the people or heard of a lot of the people. I'd heard of a couple. But it's sad that I don't even know this piece of history. So I've got a lot to learn. But some of the things you were saying, like some of the reasons you're so cynical is because there's so many levels deep that we have to go.
well, I mean, a lot of this obviously is centered around power and centered around money with respect to changes. And it seems like it's just human nature that we don't want to give up any. So we know who's in power in this country, and we know who has the money in this country. White males, for the most part, and they don't want to give up either. So, for us to get out of this, people need to be educated. Like Jackie is saying, she didn't know. Now she knows, or she's starting to learn. She's starting to educate herself. But education is huge. It's a big equalizer for anybody trying to get out of their status and their rut. But it seems like we don't have the money supposedly don't have the money to do that. But you saw how much money the government spent, and rightfully so, don't get me wrong, but how easily we came up with the money for the people during the quarantine of the pandemic and everything. But we don't seem to be able to find the money for these social issues that would carry us so much farther with respect to the issues that we have right now. So yes, it's politics, but it's also healthcare, it's also education, it's also housing and food and all these other social needs that once again would take money, but nobody in power seems to want to do that, want to spend that money. So then we end up being stuck in the same rut. And once again, my cynicism. One example, I mean, we're still in the midst of a pandemic, but the news has reported very vividly who's dying from coronavirus. It's not majority whites, it's majority blacks, it's majority Latinos, it's majority Native Americans. And why is that? Because these people, we live in neighborhoods where we don't have nice public grocery stores or Trader Joe's or what have you. So where do you get your food from? You get it maybe from the local bodega. So the food is much more expensive. The produce isn't fresh, and so, or you have a single mom with 2 or 3 kids who is on a huge budget, and you need to feed your family, and it's cheaper to get food from McDonald's, a meal deal, or KFC, or any number of unhealthy choices with respect to your food choices. which then causes obesity, which causes diabetes, which causes heart disease, and all the other problems and ailments that we're seeing contribute to the deaths of coronavirus. So all of this stuff is systemic. All of this stuff is been throughout the history of this country we live in, and none of it's going to change without money. We're starting to see the change with respect to the people and their thoughts, but people and thoughts don't pay the bills. And so, and the people who control the purse strings are once again white males in the United States. And if they're not going to release those purse strings, then nothing's going to change, or very little is going to change. So.
Is there anything else you want to add?
No. I mean, I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Obviously, the topic is greater than the 10 or 15 minutes that we've spent here talking, but I think a lot of people out there are learning, are going online and seeing the different organizations and hearing from their friends, speaking out against these issues. Once again, I apologize if I'm not as excited and as gung-ho as my lovely wife here, but once again, I've lived it for 55 years. It's almost like someone coming to you and saying, hey, have you read this great new book? This is an awesome book. And you've read the book and you've known about the book for years and years and years, and I've tried to get you to read the book, and finally you read the book and you're just super excited about it. I'm just not as excited because I know the book and I've seen the book and I know up to this point how it's always ended, and I would just hope that the ending would be a little different this time.
A happy ending?
But we'll see.
So I'm not losing hope, and I know he's not losing hope either, but educate yourself, learn, listen to other people's views, and I will put the links for the 13th, the documentary on Netflix. I'm listening to a really good book, White Fragility. As white people, we're not even aware of racism at times, and we've got to become aware. We've got to listen. So thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing your voice.
You're welcome.